Hi, my name is William or Bill Bridges. Thank you for the introduction, Fred and or Don. This will be the third time we've presented a paper with this title, Issues with LOPA, Comments from the Originators. And we're doing this on the 20th anniversary of the LOPA book. In this presentation, we'll go over issues that we've seen and are still seeing with the approaches to people using LOPA, the technical issues. We'll also go over issues with the administrative use of LOPA and how it's being used at chemical companies. As a brief history, we don't want to spend much time on this, but LOPA was originated in the mid-90s. It was originated in a couple of companies, plus a couple others were dabbling in it as well. And out of that, we begin to see the need to codify our approach for a simplified risk assessment into a guideline book. And we approached CCPS, Art Dowell and I did, and they agreed. And so we put together the first LOPA book. Took up almost 5 years of development time before it was finally issued. And it was a pretty good book. And then we saw issues with it over the years. And so the guidelines for initiating events and IPL's book was then put together. That took 7 years, and that was issued in 2015. And there was another book on conditional modifiers that also came out, and I'll mention it later. The intent of LOPA, it's a risk assessment method, and it's meant to be simplified risk assessment in order of magnitude only estimates. And there's a reason for that, and that's because none of the estimates by risk assessments are any better than order of magnitude. So you might as well just admit it. We also wanted something with rules that PHA team leaders could learn without having to go to quantitative risk assessment school and learn fault trees and consequence modeling and event trees and human reliability event trees. And we think LOPA meets that needs. You can tell us if it did or not. LOPA does not find accident scenarios. Qualitative methods such as PHA methodologies, HAZOP, what if, FMEA, other qualitative methods. They're excellent at helping a team to brainstorm and capturing that information. And then LOPA can be used as needed to help quantify the answer if the qualitative team has trouble making a decision. There have been many gains from LOPA over the past 25 years of use. The most common gain has been how we talk to each other. We now have a common definition of a barrier, an independent protection layer. We know what that means. There's a common definition to that. Most people adhere to it. We know what an initiating event means now, and we know how to put all that together in a common language. The first LOPA issue shown here is people still don't follow the rules of LOPA. They want to invent their own rules or just not follow rules in general. But one of the main rules they have to follow, which isn't always followed, is IPLs are not truly independent. That's one of the rule breaks we've seen. IPLs should be independent of the initiating event, independent of other IPLs, other independent protection layers, IPLs. On this drawing, there's a simple tank, and I've put a red line around the initiating event, which is the level control loop, the feed-forward loop, into this tank. Now, anything that's within that red line is off limits to be used in any other part of the same LOPA scenario where it's been identified already as a feature. In this case, the initiating event frequency feature. So the initiating event is the level control loop failing, leading to high level or low level. And now that we've used that loop, we can't use anything else within this boundary for any other part of this same LOPA scenario. So the high level alarm can't be used, the low level alarm can't be used if you wanted to consider human response IPLs. There's another point here, that is, you shouldn't break this loop apart to estimate the frequency of the initiating event. So don't go with your knowledge or tables that only look at the level control valve failure or the level sensor failure. The whole loop's failure is what we consider, and that's many or type of failures, many ors. So that's why that's another reason we draw the boundaries, and it's good for you to get used to drawing such boundaries in your own LOPA. Another problem we've seen is people not following the LOPA rules is they sometimes use indefensible IPL values, the same for initiating event values as well. You need to make sure that whatever you're claiming is truly capable, such as can the operator, if it's a human response IPL, can the operator truly turn the valve by themselves? Do they need a wrench? Is it handy? Also, many organizations are still picking numbers out of a handbook, such as the first LOPA book, even, and saying, "Well, there's a value for my BPCS loop, so I can count it and give this value to it." Or here's a value for a check valve has an independent protection layer. I can use that value. And that's really not what you're supposed to be doing. And that led to the writing of the second LOPA book, if you will, in the series, the guidelines for initiating events and IPLs. That book was totally focused on making sure people are maintaining their IPLs and their initiating events, which we'll talk about here next. Um, IPLs and initiating events must be maintained or else they're of no value. This has nothing to do with calculating LOPA. It has everything to do with managing the risk of a process safety accident at your site. Yes, it does affect the calculation. If you don't maintain your IPLs, then you haven't passed all the tests, all the rules of an IPL, and you should take no credit. So you should maintain them. You should be able to know that you're claiming a good value. You may not have enough statistics at your own site to prove the value you're using, but if you're maintaining it like your peers say you should be able to get the values that they claim they get when they do similar stuff. And these are collected in the handbooks just mentioned. Uh, one specific IPL that is not being validated very well in the industry as a whole around the world is human response IPL. So if an alarm comes on, a human has to hear it, decide what it means, go out in the field and do something, or do something from the control room. That whole sequence has to be timed and tested, and recorded, and averaged. And that should happen once a year per operator per critical alarm. And there's some good papers on this on our website that is free for you to use. Those are really good information on the background of how to validate a human IPL and the specifics of how to do it. In addition, you really should be validating your initiating event frequencies. Very few companies do this right now, or at least don't do it the way we would have expected it as the authors of LOPA. So your IPLs are just as critical, your initiating event frequencies are just as critical to ensure as the probability of failing on demand of an IPL. So they're both statistics and a calculation of risk. If your initiating event frequency goes up, your risk of the whole scenario goes up. Um, Another big issue we've seen, and it's getting more prevalent, I think. Art Dow also has a similar opinion. Too many people have a lot of confidence in conditional modifiers and enabling events. This even led to CCPS chartering the textbook on the same topic. The originators of LOPA don't agree on using conditional modifiers and enabling events. We mentioned them in the first LOPA book, yes, but that was only kind of in the context of completing the picture. They're usually used inappropriately, the wrong values are used. You can't really prove these values are valid. In many cases, they're just wrong, like the probability of presence, if there's an alarm or strong indication. The human's going to go into the process and try to figure out what's going on, and they'll be probably walking into the vulnerability zone, right in the harm's way. How do you manage changes to the underlying assumptions of an initiating event, of an enabling event or conditional modifier? All these are real problems. And so with that, it's just best if you focus on independent protection layers and initiating events. These are concrete things we can maintain and more or less hang our hats on. If you want to use conditional modifiers or enabling events, we don't recommend it, but there are maybe 1 or 2% of the time the scenarios we might use them. There's some guidance in this paper from PII on how we use them, and you're welcome to use that as well. And there is the book I mentioned from CCPS, although most of my comments in that book as a co-author were don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And the same as comments from Art Dow, who was a peer reviewer of the same book. Here's a table of of the rules we would use if we had to use conditional modifiers, if we were forced to, or enabling events. And there's several of these tables in our paper. Another error we've seen or problem we've seen is overconfidence in the numbers that are being used or generated by LOPA. This really applies to any risk assessment, whether it's QRAs, default trees, event trees, human reliability event trees. You never can get a statistical result that is better than simply an order of magnitude. You'll see analysts out there that will give you 1.25 times 10 to the minus 3 per year as an estimate of the risk. You don't even know which year it is. So it isn't 1.225. It's 10 to the minus 3 plus or minus a factor of 10. So plus or minus 1 on the exponent. That's all the better we know most of the statistics that we're using in LOPA. So the confidence band, the uncertainty, if you will, of the end result is always expressed as plus or minus, should always be expressed as 10 to an exponent. So 10 to the minus 4 plus or minus 1, that's all the better we know. In addition, I showed 10 to the minus 6 here on reason. That's kind of a inside LOPA joke at PII. We will never know if our risk calculations in the 10 to the minus 5, 10 to the minus 4 range is accurate, or 10 to the minus 6 range is accurate. The only thing industry has been able to prove over a long period of time is the capability to manage to maybe 10 to the minus 4 probability of a scenario per year. Just to illustrate a little bit better how LOPA works, I'm showing you a risk matrix here. It's a 5 by 7. It's got orders of magnitude of consequences, orders of magnitude of frequency. And we start a scenario at some coordinate on that risk matrix, which is, by the way, a log-log plot of base 10. So we're just orders of magnitude, and that's all the better we know the numbers. I'm showing circle big blobs of paint here because that's all the better certainty. That's all the more certainty we have in the values we're using. And so as we layer in different IPLs, each of them have different uncertainties, but the end result is probably going to be as big as the biggest uncertainty we have, or even bigger, because of common cause failures might tilt the calculation in one direction or another, probably in the worst direction. So by the time we're done, we have plus or minus an order of magnitude on frequency, probably plus or minus an order of magnitude or half an order of magnitude on the consequence side. So just be aware of this when you're doing calculations. And we also have this reinforced in our heads because many of us know how to do quantitative risk assessments. And because of that, we've studied what went on in the nuclear power industry during their infancy. And to certify a nuclear reactor to be safe enough to license, you had to prove that the core meltdown probability was about 10 to the minus 6 per year. But they haven't hit that number. Their values, they've had 8 meltdowns out of 14,000 reactor years. You calculate that on your own, you'll find out it's about 10 to the minus 4. It's a little bit worse than 10 to the minus 4. It's close to 10. It's in between 10 to the minus 4 and 10 to the minus 3. So if they can't hit their values, they're off by at least a factor of 200. Don't you think maybe we're going to do the same thing just in the hope of reaching 10 to the minus 5 or 10 to the minus 6? This is why I said earlier, I think 10 to the minus 4 should be our reasonable lower limit of what our risk can be. One other issue we've seen is failure to account for high demand mode on the first IPL. What this means is if you have a very high frequency event, that the initiating event frequency is more than twice of the test frequency of the initiating event, then you should throw that initiating event away as the starting point, and then take the first IPL in the sequence and look at its initiating event frequency, its failure rate per year, and just use that value. And you can look these up in tables. So if it's a pressure regulator, happens to be the first IPL you come to, or if it's an interlock, or if it's a check valve, you can look those values up in a table for initiating events and find a value for it. This will prevent you from estimating the risk too high and require too many IPLs. If you don't know the initiating event frequency, you can go backwards through the equation for calculating PFD as shown at the bottom of the slide and estimate the initiating event frequency of the new initiating event, the first IPL, and use that in the equation instead by knowing the test frequency of it and knowing the PFD of that first IPL. Another problem we've seen is just simply the overuse of LOPA. We expected LOPA to be used maybe 5%, at the most 10%, but currently at PII we're using LOPA at 1 to 3% of the time. And what we mean by that is our PHA teams are very good when they're led right at making very good decisions with the fuzzy logic and a little bit of prodding on statistical failure rates here and there. But there are going to be scenarios that are over everybody's head. We don't know what's going on completely, and we would recommend further study, and part of that is LOPA. Also using LOPA in other redundant studies like seal analysis or seal determination rather. If you've done your PHA right, you know what seal you need, and you know what safety intermittent function you need, and you know what seal value it should have, what should be the safety integrity level. So you're already done. And so from PII, we recommend you do qualitative risk assessments mostly, and then supplement that with LOPA only when you're really necessary. The final issue I wanted to go over is how you're doing LOPA and the resources applied to it. Typically, LOPA can be done by a single analyst outside the meeting, maybe 1.5 analyst, an analyst calling people on the phone from time to time. First LOPA book never mentioned the LOPA team. We never intended for there to be a team. So there's no requirement from LOPA book or from the originators, and nothing was even foreseen. So we think it's wasteful. Just in conclusion, the main things I want to leave you with is make sure you're focusing properly on the use of LOPA and not overusing it. We recommend you not use the conditional modifiers enabling events at all. Close the gaps on doing the inspection test preventive maintenance, the maintaining, the validating of your IPLs and initiating events. And don't believe the numbers when they get too low. They're probably false. And recognize that all the numbers that's being reported are plus or minus an order of magnitude. Thanks for your attention. Bye for now.